Well, Hans, this week we saw the release of a report from the Senate committee on the assassination attempt on President Trump. And basically, it was an analysis of what went wrong at the Secret Service surrounding that event, both leading up to it and on the day of. And it frankly, in my opinion, it didn't get the attention that it deserved. We ended up getting an article out on it, which we can link in here. And I, I'll be curious to see what you think, but I found the report to be absolutely damning. I also found the report to be sort of scarce on certain details, a little unnervingly so. But one of the big findings was the fact that the lead advance agent was told ahead of time, well ahead of time, that there was a credible threat to President Trump, and that information was never transmitted to anybody. It literally died and siloed with the lead advance agent, and they did nothing in preparation for that. And, this is the kind of report that I should be getting, more attention, and people should at least take a cut through for themselves. The total report, again, is 133 pages in length, but in the first part of that, there is both a summary of the findings and then a follow-up, which is a summary of failures by the Secret Service. And that can all be had in the first 10 pages or so. And it's something that, honestly, everybody should go look at because it is, I think the best way I can sum it up is the incompetence is so great that I kept finding myself personally walking through this and only being able to come to the conclusion that the incompetence level was so great that it had to be planned for. It could not have occurred naturally. I was very upset by it. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, what struck me was similar to what you just said, is the amount of, should we just call them mistakes that were made and that are being acknowledged here. I mean, actually, why don't we just go through them just to give everyone an idea of what's being admitted here. So the Secret Service failed to define responsibilities for planning the security of the July 13th event. That's even before the event, no planning. Then they failed to ensure that the AGR building where the shooter was covered. They failed to coordinate with state and local law enforcement. They failed to provide resources for Trump's security at that rally. They failed to communicate anything about the suspicious person, the shooter, who had been seen a long ways ahead of time. So, and then each of those points that I just read out has a whole bunch of subpoints, which are also failures. So that's a lot of failures, no question about it. And then, of course, as you rightly say, the question is that all just can one organization be so incredibly incompetent to have gotten all of that wrong, or is there more to it?
Well, the thing that really, again, disturbed me the most, because a lot of these things we sort of knew of, right? We now have greater detail, obviously in a 133-page report. But the thing that really upset me the most was, the detail that was actually kind of buried a little bit and I thought should have been the most prominent. And again, it was the fact that the lead advance agent responsible for all of this was told in a phone call on July 9th, she received a call from the second supervisor of the Trump detail, this is at the Secret Service level, telling her that USS counter snipers would be assigned to the rally. Now, what she also said was, let me find it here. I've actually lost it. Was warned that there was credible intelligence that existed of a threat against President Trump. And she was told that by an unnamed senior official at the Secret Service. Now, you would think that that would be something that you would want to pass along and actually maybe start taking planning steps for. Like already, instantly, that rally is no longer something that's just an ordinary rally that the Secret Service prepares for every time. But rather than doing that, not only did this person, it's a she, and I think we probably can guess exactly who this person is because I think my best guess is they were prominently featured ducking down during the melee. But this person, again, it's a female, didn't tell anybody what happened. Not only did she fail to tell anybody else what happened, she wrote a security planning document and literally said there was no adverse intelligence containing the coming event relating to Trump. despite the fact that she was directly told that there was credible intelligence. Now, there was other failures that went along with this as well. The Pittsburgh Secret Service office reached out to the FBI and sent them a letter asking was there any credible intelligence, and they were told there was. Actually, what happened is the FBI didn't respond to them in any way, shape, or form, despite it being an official letter sent in advance. There was another Secret Service agent that reached out to Secret Service brass back at headquarters asking the same question. Is there, not knowing that there was a threat, but asking, hey, the events, tomorrow, is there any new intelligence that we should be aware of? And the answer came back silence, crickets, nothing. No, business as usual. Despite the fact that we emphatically she was emphatically told that there was. And I guess I just want to stop here because I already kind of blurred it together. There is the lead advance agent and the person who told her at U.S. Secret Service headquarters, and then kind of everybody else. So those two people knew of the credible threat. Nobody else did. None of the other Secret Service detail, none of the other people, the Pittsburgh office reaching out, they didn't know, etc. So they're very vague with names in the reports, as they typically are. They assign labels to them. We know who one of these parties is. The rest were less certain.
What I would sort of say against that, I mean, not that I disagree, but my emphasis reading the report was elsewhere. I'll get to that in a moment. But I guess they get a lot of threats all the time. So in order to assess that, and I completely agree with you, there's not enough information here about, for instance, what I'd like to know is what's the volume of threats? What's the quality of those tips they get? Because in order to kind of empirically assess this, you need to have that information. If this was particularly credible, or particularly unusual, and so on, absolutely, everything you just said. But again, we just need to know more about that. The thing that stuck out to me, again, it's not that it wasn't known, but it's just that it's all acknowledged. There's the huge admissions throughout the whole report. It's pretty maddening, frankly. It's about that building, the American Glass Research, or AGR building. That's where the shooter was on top of that building. Now, you do not need to be a Secret Service agent. You do not need to be law enforcement. You just need to have like a couple of functioning brain cells to figure out that place is a very, very dangerous place. That's a prime location for a shooter. I've never been to Butler, Pennsylvania, but I've looked at the 3D Google Maps and all that kind of stuff of that area. Anyone who does that with a couple of functioning brain cells would immediately identify that building with a clear line of sight straight at the at Trump's stage as a very as a dangerous place, as a place where there might be a shooter, a place you need to keep an eye on, all of those kinds of things. And on this very point, there's a whole number of things that the report talks about that, like no clear line of sight between the Secret Service counter snipers and that place. Obviously, no proper scouting of that place, no security, no coverage, we already mentioned no coordination with local law enforcement, on and on and on. So again, why does that stick out to me? Why is that kind of one of the main points to me? Because it's so obvious. It's so obvious to, again, anyone whatsoever. I mean, a 5-year-old could figure out that that's a place you need to keep an eye on. The fact that there was not an eye kept on that place, and that they knew 27 minutes ahead of time that there was a shooter there, is just completely mind-boggling.
One thing that's worth noting about that, when you talked about it being obvious, well, it was so obvious that local law enforcement was on tape in the aftermath of that during that same day saying, God damn it, we told them that they had to be watching that was a weak point. Local law enforcement saw it instantly. So the Secret Service had to see it. But I do want to go back and address one point. there was the mention of wanting to get a kind of a handle on the amount of threats that come through and whether this would, or, where does it fall in the context? And one thing that struck me going through that document, and I'm just going reading here, the committee was told by numerous U.S. Secret Service personnel that and I'm quoting, their expectation was that any credible threat or intelligence would appear in the planning document. And we know, it's another quote, that the lead advance agent did not inform her superiors or other U.S. Secret Service personnel involved with planning and securing the Butler rally that she was told of a threat. And that was a pervasive statement that was throughout that document, is to a man of everybody who appeared to have been interviewed, all said they should have known about that. So just trying to give proper context to that.
I agree, but I would still like to know the numbers here. This is an empirical question. How often, how many? I mean, after the event, anyone can say, well, there was a threat, we should have passed it along. And of course they should have passed it along. Of course there was terrible communication and so on and so forth. But just to assess that more precisely, I would just like to dig down on those figures. And not only the numbers of threats, but also the quality of those tips. I don't think that's been done.
No, I don't think, well, at least I didn't see it. And that was I'm going to read something else here that plays into that a bit. But it was notable that something that I found personally to be of kind of new information, significant note, that it was effectively downplayed. There was a mention of it. It's one of the lower bullet points in the summary, and it's not elaborated on greatly. And you have to go all the way to page 66 in the document before you even find any further discussion of it, and it's not lengthy, which I found sort of both notable and surprising. But on July 10th, remember July 13th is the actual date of this, the USS Pittsburgh office sent a letter to the FBI requesting any intelligence related to Trump and the rally. According to the Senate report, the FBI did not respond to the Pittsburgh office's letter, nor did they share any intelligence information with the U.S. Secret Service in response to the letter. On the morning of July 13th, another USS intelligence agent called USS Secret Service headquarters and asked if any adverse intelligence had been developed concerning the visit. Despite the earlier warning that was given to the lead advance agent, headquarters told the intelligence agent that no information had been received. I found that to be sort of mind-blowing. And again, as much as anything, I was taken aback by the fact that there wasn't great elaboration on this in the Senate report. I found that pretty almost as alarming as I found the information itself. So
yeah, I agree. And what's the sort of the wider picture here that's almost forgotten in a way 2 months on, especially with such a damning report now, and it's still kind of forgotten, is that people actually died, number one.
Yeah.
And by half an inch or whatever, Trump would have been dead right now. Those are extremely serious facts. And yet, that's almost kind of cast by the wayside. And then, of course, that leads us into, the second time it happened. Not quite, because apparently no shots were fired. But I guess that's the Ryan Ruth, the second shooter, the Miami shooter. I don't think he would have missed. Have you? I know we're moving on now to the kind of a second shooting here, but have you looked at the Google Maps of how close he would have been had Trump moved from, I think it was the 5th green to the 6th tee? That would have been a pretty easy shot. And they saw a rifle protruding apparently, and then he ran away, and that whole story. But leading on from the first one, how does that even happen? How can you not check your perimeter? How can you rely on someone luckily seeing a rifle protruding from some bushes, especially if you already had the situation in Butler a few weeks earlier?
And no drones being used. We've talked about that before.
Good point,
the fact that something that's so readily accessible and easy to deploy and cheap was not used. And moreover, was it only not used? There was pushback about using it going forward, which just strikes me as utter insanity. One other thing before we continue, a little detail here that also involves the same lead advance agent. So the lead advance agent, who was aware of the credible intelligence of a threat against Trump, told the committee that Trump's Secret Service detail requested a counter-assault team or counter-assault team liaisons to help coordinate tactical assets in advance of the July 13th rally, but the Secret Service denied that request. In spite of that denial, once again, the lead advance agent, there was no pushback. Never said anything, never relayed the credible intelligence either to any members of the Trump team or to anybody involved in the denial of service. So first of all, how would that be denied if you had a credible threat? And if you're the only person kind of on the ground who's aware of that information, and that ask for extra support is denied, why are you not using that information to push back or even informing anybody else around you? None of it makes any sense, which comes back to that original statement that if you have all these levels of coordinated missteps and incompetence, that at some point it becomes very difficult to accept it simply as competence, but rather as planning.
Yeah, no, we have a very similar scenario with the FBI. I don't want to digress too far here, but there's at a minimum, and as far as the FBI and Trump and Russiagate and all of that is concerned, I've certainly moved way beyond this. But at a minimum, this is a case of toxic management culture, where you have these agencies where the management is has sort of bred such a toxic culture that people aren't willing to speak up. Everything is CYA and so on and so forth. Now, very early on with the FBI, with Russiagate and so on, that was where I was going with my thoughts on this. This is many, many, many years ago. Obviously, it was shown that it was more than that. That's not to say that the culture isn't toxic, but there was also horrible corruption and there was outright treason. Obviously, we've talked about that many times. So in this case, I'm obviously, a horribly toxic culture within the Secret Service, terribly run, all that kind of stuff. I'm just not quite there yet for that next step. But certainly this report has pushed me a bit further along that path.
Yeah, and I more am there. There's another element too, although we had some hints of this. All the recordings for the Secret Service were erased, which is completely reminiscent of everything the FBI's done in terms of wiping out phones, etc. It's always convenient, the moments in which they manage to wipe out all the information. Local law enforcement, by contrast, seemingly should be held to a much lower level of kind of professionalism and a lower expectation. Local law enforcement preserved all their communications. Secret Service wiped theirs out.
Yeah, that's how we got the body cams and so on. With that, if it had been a pure Secret Service event with no local law enforcement activities or presence at all, you're right. There would be nothing. There would be nothing we could work with. By the way, on the topic of the drones, I remember with Kyle Rittenhouse, there was aerial footage that basically absolved him.
Yeah,
and that was concealed for was it 2 years? I mean, it was a long time that it was concealed. So there's maybe that other shoe is still going to drop. I don't know. We don't know what else we're going to find out. But I just there is certainly a culture of concealing stuff and kind of dribbling it out, over a very long period of time after people have forgotten.
I mean, because you started to draw parallels with the FBI's broader actions and earlier actions, and I think that's a good point. First of all the agencies, I would have sort of thought the Secret Service would have been the most impervious to this whole kind of rolling corruption that's managed to make its way through every single one of our federal agencies. And I guess for me, what was so notable is realizing, at a minimum, all these incredible levels of incompetence that, again, I am kind of ascribing nefarious reasons to them. But whether you do or don't, it's kind of like they were the last agency to fall. Like, oh my God, even the U.S. Secret Service is at the very best, utterly incompetent and being directed kind of by political whims, assigning greater protection to Joe Biden and lesser protection to Trump, et cetera, deployment of assets, despite a pretty robust budget, that even that agency is a mess and has been politicized.
They've
And
all,
if the
they've all
U.S. Secret
fallen
Service
right.
has been stirred up and politicized and maybe even weaponized, everything has been.
I always keep thinking back to 2015, 16, around that time. If you told me that all these institutions, all these agencies, all these departments, that they're totally corrupt to their core, I wouldn't have believed you. And yet, that is exactly what happened. And NIH, Fauci's organization, right? And Francis Collins, I mean, completely, maybe even more corrupt than the other ones. Just incredible corruption right down to the core. If you told me that you could have told me in 2019 and I wouldn't have believed you, even after I knew about all the FBI stuff and the DOJ stuff, because I would have thought, oh, that's health, that's research.
That's science.
That's medicine. Right, exactly. It's very sad. I'm just trying to think here. Is there any agency that is not corrupt, or where I still have some kind of tiny belief that maybe it's not completely corrupted? And maybe national parks, I'm sure there's something there too, but you're right. I mean, they're all gone. They've all fallen like dominoes. It's terrible.
I remember taking a look at the DOJ and coming across a couple studies that had been done from an outside perspective, where I don't know how they came about them, but somebody was able to analyze all of the resumes of people who'd been hired at the DOJ under Obama and Holder at one particular division. And what that person found was, it was, I believe the numbers are, don't quote me, but it's going to be close, 127 to 0. And what those numbers meant was 127 extreme leftists, not center left, not Democrats. We're talking, full on blown progressives were the people that were hired at the DOJ, and 0 for everybody else. And it wasn't that resumes weren't submitted. And it's easy for people to say, oh, well, it's a, each administration gets to put in their own people. Well, that's yes and no. At the political appointee level, they can, but at these lower line levels, they're not supposed to treat any resume differently than any other. It's supposed to be merit hiring. Now, of course, we don't, we're not Pollyanna. We understand how the world works. You fully expect that there's going to be a left bias. But to have that level of bias implicit in the hiring, that was the pollution of the DOJ. And I don't know about you, but I feel like if somebody asked me what were my biggest mistakes as I was wading into Russiagate and trying to understand this thing in the first few years, it was that I couldn't quite bring myself to believe that basically everybody was bad. There was this sort of perception on my part that there's got to be a couple of good guys in government. We can't have everybody aligned against us. And it took a long time before it really started to sink home that no, it's not a few bad apples at the top. The FBI is corrupted all the way through. It's an institutional problem, and that carries over everywhere else. Even I.G. Horowitz was testifying yesterday and came out and said that he, on January 6th, was asked questions about when he could tell how many it's clear FBI agents were embedded in the crowd. How many was it? Hundreds. It seemed to be, the number softly appears to be in the hundreds, but how big was it? And he said, well, that information can't come out until after the election. How convenient. Just remember, Horowitz is the same guy who initiated an investigation into the FBI's handling of the Trump campaign in January 12th, 2017. And on the surface, that sounded great. Somebody outside is looking at this. What actually happened? That investigation encompassed everything that the FBI was doing, kept congressional investigators from looking at it, and that investigation was extended multiple times. The report was delayed, didn't come out until December 2019. I now look back on that, and I see Horowitz as being a watchdog for the agencies who instigated his investigation to kind of capture all of that and tie it up and keep it, he's sort of like a Bill Barr character where he's doing some good at the margins and kind of talks a good story. But on the larger scheme of things, he effectively, if you just look at what he did, He protected the FBI and the larger establishment for most of Trump's administration.
If if we all kind of think of investigations, government investigations as cover-ups,
Right.
we'd all be a lot better off.
Yep.
That should be the starting kind of premise. And I think in every single case, it turns out to be correct. How long did you mention Horowitz, of course, how long did that hold up the truth from coming out? Years and years and years. Trump was going to declassify in 2018, and then he was told he can't because of these investigations. And it's the same thing over and over. Before we move on here, I just wanted to, I did think of one that maybe, most people don't know about that, I fell off my chair when I found out the U.S. Geological Survey. You think, whoa, those guys, they're not corrupted. They're not political. That's just the Geological Survey, right? Well, those guys covered up the origin of COVID. They were involved with this diffuse proposal in 2018. And that's basically a blueprint for making COVID down to all the details. And that was going to be done at the Wuhan lab. So this was in 2018. And the U.S. Geological Survey was part of that. I mean, it's a long story as to why they were part of that.
Right.
But that may or may not have been corrupt. But the cover-up certainly was corrupt because why didn't anyone at the U.S. Geological Survey kind of tell us in late 2019, early 2020, when the virus arrived, like, we have some information here. We actually have a blueprint for making this virus at the Wuhan lab, and here's a copy. No, they covered it all up. So, yeah, no, I still haven't, long story short is I still have not thought of a single agency that has not been corrupted, sadly.
Well, moreover, at that, there was 15 different agencies that were part of that meeting where that proposal was presented. Right. And I think both of us, our thought was, how is it possible that many people could have been exposed to this and not one comes forth? Like statistically, that just seems improbable, that there has to be a whistleblower that would come forth, and none did. And I think both you and I in our investigations, we found that time and again, where we've looked into something and we thought for sure somebody's naturally going to come forth as part of the institution. It's going to be upset by what happened and want to tell people about it. Like, too many people know about this, so it can't be a secret kind of approach. And
Right.
Time and again, they all act in unison, and it is kept a secret.
It's incredible, isn't it? And yet, now we can, move on kind of to broaden out this, the assassination topic. And yet, people who should know better keep falling for the same hoaxes and the same lies from the same kinds of people whom we're just talking about here, from the corrupted institutions, these DC insider people. And what I'm talking about, of course, is that we've now had these 2 assassination attempts, and now Avril Haines is out there telling everyone that it's actually Iran that wants to assassinate Trump, that it's Iran. Now, of course, that may or may not be true, and there may be something to it or not. But the fact that it came from Avril Haines is our first hint, and it's more than a hint. It's like overwhelming evidence
Blazing red
that
alarm.
is not true,
Right.
or at least that we should not lend it any credence whatsoever because it comes from her. And yet, you have so many people parroting that line. It's deeply frustrating. I mean, at this point, we're like 8 years, 9 years into all this, meaning, exposing all this corruption at every single level of the government, at every agency. And now we have one of the biggest exemplars of that, Avril Haines. We can talk about her here in a moment, saying something, and a lot of people jump on that bandwagon. Still, it's frustrating.
And it's even, especially in the larger scheme of things, in that you look that, you had major establishment figures. Kagan jumps to mind, the husband of Victoria Nuland, writing the editorial claiming that Trump is Hitler and he's got to be stopped by any means, right when the cases were winding down. They realized that the cases probably weren't going to stop Trump, and literally telling people that this is an existential event and Trump has to be stopped by any means possible. Then we've seen the rhetoric heat up by every politician on the left, including the DOJ itself and the Biden administration, saying that Trump's an existential threat. Even after the first attempt, they waited, maybe they had the good graces to wait a week or two. And then they started that rhetoric up right again. The second attempt with Ralph, heck, the next day they were doing it.
Yep.
So you
And
literally
they
have these
released
claims. You had the DOJ releasing the bounty letter from Ralph.
Exactly.
That there's a bounty on Trump. Hey, you can come collect it. Here's the letter, when they won't release the manifestos. All of these actions, and then suddenly you have the head of the CIA, who was quite literally, has been involved in many other aspects in the past, comes forth and says, "Oh, it's Iran. Don't worry, it's a threat from Iran." I shake my head when I see people just going along with this. I can't agree with you more emphatically. It's not to say that it couldn't ultimately be Iran, but then there's got to be an aspect to how did they get in here. There's a whole, this pointing the finger at a shiny object when all the actions of the establishment are to attack Trump. And then, oh, look over here, it's Iran. It's nonsense.
Avril Haines, so many, and that's why we keep hearing about these same names, keeps getting recycled into there's this process in DC where, by the way, it works on the Republican side as well. Hopefully, Trump 47 will put an end to it by not hiring any one of these people. Anyway, the process is you get to be in a position in the administration. If your party happens to lose the presidency, then you get transplanted into some, fake NGO or fake think tank or some crap like that and still get a huge salary and get a lovely title. So like after 2017, all of Biden's people, what's his name? Blinken and, all of these guys, they all went to the Biden,
Jake Sullivan, all those people.
Right, Sullivan, and on and on and on. They all went to the Biden Penn Center, whatever it was called. It was just this giant grift, it's meaningless. It's just an office somewhere, and you have a fancy title, and China pays, or whoever. I think there was a story about China funding Penn, and then indirectly
they're definitely tied in with funding.
Anyway, you get dirty money from wherever funding the whole thing. These guys get nice salaries. They get to continue their Washington, D.C. life. They get to continue having nice titles, everything. And as soon as their party's back in power, then they get recycled into one of these positions. And Avril, I think it's Avril Haines, is exactly one of these people, as is her best friend, Lisa Monaco, as is their shared best friend, Susan Rice. Those three are besties, right? And of course, those three were deeply involved with the Russia hoax. So, and they were all a part of the Obama administration. And now you get to the point where, okay, they had to leave for a couple of years. Many of them did not have to leave because, Trump was, not paying attention or was persuaded to hire all these horrible. I mean, Fiona Hill is one who was allowed to be in the Trump administration. It's just incredible, One who wasn't was Victoria Nuland. That's another one who was on that exact same kind of cycle. So to his credit, she was not allowed to be in the Trump administration in any way whatsoever. But of course, as soon as Biden came in, she was back in. Anyway, that's the way the system works. By the way, the Republicans have something similar going on with their, GOP class there in Washington. And Avril Haines is one of them, and a big one of them. Why would we trust anything she says? I mean, as she was DNI when Congress decided, I think it was unanimous or near unanimous, that everything to do with COVID origins had to be released. And then she didn't release it. She just sent us one pager saying, well, whatever, just making up some excuse. She's part of the DC establishment. She's part of the people who run these hoaxes. She's part of the people who cover everything up. And yet we're supposed to believe her?
Yeah, it's the same. Another one that comes to mind is Susan Powers, who was, running the UN and is now running USAID, which is driving the flow of illegals into our country. I mean, she's directly behind that.
Right.
So I think in times past, they might have been able to get away with that a little bit better. And people are starting to become a little bit more aware of who these people are. people like you and I and thousands of others that are out there doing this kind of work, following these career paths. Another area where they go to is the think tanks. Think tanks, like Brookings and Atlantic. I always kind of think of Brookings as the domestic think tank for the establishment, and the Atlantic Council sort of being the international think tank for the establishment. But think tanks are another place where these people go and get very well paid, lavish lifestyles with tons of benefits, free travel, et cetera, et cetera. And they just, if they happen to not get pulled into an agency in a given administration, they're in these jobs and they cycle right back as soon as the next administration changes. You mentioned Newland. Newland's been, she's been in every single administration since the Clintons, with the exception of Trump. That was the only one. And at high levels, going back to Ukraine. So anyway.
There is maybe we can close it off here with what's the solution? The solution that I've been advocating, and I know we've kind of come a long way now from talking about assassination, but indirectly it's related because it's that Washington, D.C. corruption. And I don't even want to like using the word swamp anymore. I know we used it for many years, but swamp seems far too nice, It's actually much worse than that. That's where all these problems emanate from. And the only path I see to getting rid of that, fundamentally getting rid of that, is by breaking it up, just like you would break up a monopoly company. And the way you do that is you simply, well, first of all, you just shut down a whole bunch of departments and agencies, like what Milei is doing in Argentina. Just shut it all down. There's that famous video of him going through all the names of the departments, and he's just gone, firing a whole bunch of people. I mean, if you just fired 2 million people in the federal employees, nothing would change. In fact, it would be a huge boon to the country. It would be absolutely fantastic. But all of that's not enough. You then have to just spread all of Washington across the country. There's no reason why the department of whatever needs to be in Washington. It can be, it can be in Kansas City, and someone else can be in whatever. Just spread them all over the place. Because then you break up this clique, of all these people that we just talked about, and they have all their friends and they have their kids and they all go to the same schools, and it's all like one horrible clique. And the way you break it up is you physically break it up. So the only thing that's left in Washington D.C. is White House and Congress, and that's pretty much it. Everyone else. Why does the FBI have to be in Washington D.C.? Why? No reason, right? No. By the way, that also means that a lot of these cases, whenever anything happens with any of these agencies and departments, all the cases are also in Washington, D.C. And of course, we know how completely corrupted the judiciary is there. So by farming it out, you overcome that problem too. So I think long-term, that's what you got to do. You got to just break it all apart.
I've been maintaining for a while now that sort of the single greatest source of national wealth, very immediately grabbable national wealth, lies in tearing down large elements of the federal government. In other words, like you said, firing people, spreading them across the country, dramatically downsizing. That right there, I mean, the amount of waste and inefficiency that we have going on with the federal government is almost impossible to calculate. We're talking trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions. That is just a bloated government that we don't need, that could just be shredded and gone. And your idea of sending them and dispersing them, I think, is one of the best ones. Not only are you engaging in massive downsizing, but you're disrupting the culture by spreading them apart. And that's one of the things that I think you and I have both found is sort of twofold. Is one, these people are interchangeable and they continue to pop up in the same positions. Just think of Pompeo going to the State Department and then going to the CIA. He's a perfect example. At the highest of levels, right? Running the State Department, running the CIA, doing bad things at both positions, just contemptible. And the fact that, they're all together in a little echo bubble. And also what we've seen, what we learned, our lesson learning from the FBI, is that it's not the seventh floor. It's not just the top officials, but rather it's spread throughout the entire organization. And that organization needs to be kind of torn apart and dispersed. And physical disbursement is part of that.
One of the best examples of this, just to hit home how bad it is when the Flynn case, General Flynn's case, came before a court in D.C. because of what we just said. If all these agencies are in D.C., that's where they bring their cases. Now, the case against Flynn was a total fraud. And we've talked about this before. So we're not going to, rehash that here. Just a total fraud. It was all made up. He never said what he was supposed to have said. It's just totally made up. And it was made up by Peter Strzok. Well, guess what? Peter Strzok was best friends with Rudy Contreras, who was the judge who was appointed to the Flynn case. That's the problem right there.